Olá, chegamos ao final da primeira série Blended Webinar, organizados pela Aberje e pelo King's College. Eu quero destacar o protagonismo dos nossos curadores, né? O professor Dr. Vinícius de Carvalho, lá do King's College, e do Leonardo Miller da Aberje, na organização da programação desses encontros. Bem, esse tema, né, do ESG, ele, de certa forma, ele é clássico no campo da comunicação e das relações públicas. Nesses últimos 100 anos, os grandes embates entre as organizações, destacadamente as empresas, e a sociedade e a opinião pública, se dá em volta das questões ambientais, das questões sociais e das questões de governança. A novidade agora é que nós temos a entrada forte do mercado financeiro, olhando com cuidado os impactos desses temas, né, e das ações ligadas a esses temas nas questões do levantamento aí de capitais, né, principalmente de capitais intensivos pelas empresas, né? E também uma grande questão hoje é as questões envolvendo, né, a credibilidade das narrativas, principalmente das narrativas que envolvem o relato das questões ligadas ao ESG, né? Principalmente num tempo de tanta mentira, né? Em que a gente tem aí as fake news e também os greenwashing, talvez atualizando, né, a possibilidade até dos ESG washing. Desfrutem de mais esse encontro.
Thank you, Paulo, for the kind words. I'm Leonardo Miller. We're here today for a third and final episode of Brazil and UK Dialogues and Narratives, the first series of the blended webinars, a partnership between Brazilian Association for Business Communication, Aberje, and the King's Brazil Institute from King's College London. I'd also like to thank our media partners, Revista Problemas Brasileiros and Plataforma Brasil, as well as everybody who watched the videos, sent us questions, and all of you who are watching us right now. Our topic of the day is ESG, New Frontiers to Finance and Business. As usual, our guests previously recorded a video. We invite you all to watch them afterwards, if you haven't already. It's in our website and also in our YouTube channel. Based on that, our viewers send us questions from which we selected a few that we're going to propose to our guests right now. I now pass the word to Vinícius Mariano de Carvalho, idealizer and co-curator of this project. Vinícius is the current director of King's Brazil Institute and also a member of consultative board of Aberje. Vinícius.
Thank you very much, Leonardo, for the introduction, and thank you for also our guests that are here today, taking part of their time, their precious time, to share their ideas and answer the questions that were provoked by the videos that they have sent. As you have mentioned, we in Brazil Institute, we are very proud of being part of this partnership with Aberje, exactly trying to contribute more to a mutual understanding between Brazil and UK and other actors in the world as well. So today we are very, very happy to have here with us Robert Patalano, the acting head of the Financial Markets Division in OECD, Gabriela Gutierrez Hütter, lecturer in international management at King's Business School here at King's College London, a colleague of mine, and Keivan Macedo, the sustainability director of Natura & Co. So thank you, the three of all, for making time again, and thanks Aberje for hosting us. I would like to start already kicking the ball with a question to Gabriela. Gabriela, Aline Damas from Grupo Marista, an associate of Aberje, she asked, is it necessary to have initiatives on the three pillars for ESG practices to count?
Thank you. First of all, thank you to the organizers for the invitation. So I will start unpacking that question, reframing of the counting. Does it count for who? Is it for investors? Is it for civil society? I think we know that investors may prioritize certain aspects of ESG differently. We know that some investors may care about companies that display a good performance across the 3 pillars. But we know also that investors could go for a best of worst philosophy, where we know they may be, caring about oil, tobacco companies and how they are dealing with other issues that are unconnected to the products and services. And imagine, how diverse their practices are, how well they are treating their employees, despite they may have some questionable practices in some areas. And of course, we see also the other focus that would be on excellence. So investors are wishing to invest in portfolios where companies are excelling, they have really these positive aspects. So I think, it varies how investors are dealing with that. So it doesn't matter, there are various types of investors and they will care about different things. But I think broadly, we think about civil society. I think we're reaching that point that civil society really wants to see companies that are performing well across the 3 pillars of ESG.
Thank you, Gabriela. The next question is for Keivan Macedo from Utama Rods Sandit from Hydro and Aberje Associate. How communication can capture ESG methodology and data to create a narrative that facilitate communication beyond the financial markets?
First of all, thanks Leonardo and Aberje to invitation to be part of this distinguished panel. I think that indeed is a very good question, because so far we try to establish what is going to be this narrative to facilitate the communications. I think, of course, we have as the main goal the investor. So I think that financial sector a little bit used about some of the terminology that we use. But in general, the challenge that we are facing is how we can improve, especially our annual report, which we consider that is the main piece of communications with the society in general, not only with the investor, but even with consumers and even other members of the civil society. I think that one of the challenges that we are facing is that how we can try to improve every year this piece of communications. And what we are trying to adopt in, let's say, probably the last 7 years is that we created an infographic trying to illustrate what is our business model. So with the business model, I think that it's easier to illustrate inside our value chain what are our aspects related to our governance, internal governance, but also what are the policies and how we engage our value chains considering the 2 pillars of the ESG, not only the environmental, but also the social aspects. And I think that by the end, one of the challenges that we face with this piece of communications is how we can try to illustrate the connections that we have with our business model, with the teams, the topics that we operate, and demonstrating how embed it's this strategy in our business strategy.
Thank you very much. And now we have sort of a cluster question to Robert. It's actually, we have 3 questions for you, 2 by Claudio Viveiros from the Wilson Sons Associate, also of Aberje, that are 2 questions together. The topics covered by ESG are not new, and many companies have them incorporated in their agendas and practices to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. Why did they become strategic now? Or perhaps even better, where the current momentum is coming from? That's his question. And in continuation of that, Plataforma Brasil asks, what happened for the financial markets in Brazil and worldwide to understand its responsibility and to assume its role in promoting the ESG agenda?
Very good. Thank you very much, Vinícius. And I would say thank you again to Aberje and to Leonardo and the sponsors for having this session, which at the OECD we think is very important. And it certainly is a topic for the G20 this year, which is a nice turn of events that this year there's so much focus on sustainable finance and aspects of it, including climate. So this is an excellent 3-part question. I'll see if I can take this on. So first, I'm sure the colleagues on the line here will agree with me that Forms of ESG, if you get underneath the acronym, forms of ESG have been around for many years. And I should say I started working on corporate social responsibility and governance and ratings even 20, 25 years ago. So parts of ESG have come out of social responsibility, but it really is, it has transformed in several ways. First, whilst corporate social responsibility was really bonding with stakeholders other than shareholders, ESG now is much more integrated and focused on both improving long-term shareholder value, because you're looking at reputational risks and risks that are of importance to society, and managing those risks over a much longer period of time than current financial reporting would capture. So it gets into strategic implications for companies. And then the second issue is that society is much more attuned to the concept of do no harm, that corporates and financials should take care in the externalities that they create that could have a negative impact on society. And corporates and financials are becoming more aware that investors and consumers and governments will hold them accountable, and there will be ramifications for those externalities. So I think we're making a lot of progress in those areas. And I think you've mentioned SDGs. It's really important now. There's a lot of focus on SDGs, even at the government level and at the international organization level, obviously, and that's embedded in G20 and other related fora. And as a result of that, the focus by corporates and financials to understand how their activities, of course, creating long-term value, how that relates to the SDGs is becoming not only commonplace, but really a metric that defines the credibility of many of these international companies and bodies to deliver on stakeholder value. Why don't I leave it? I'll leave it there. I'm sure there's a lot more we can say.
Actually, this is a follow-up question for you, Robert. Thank you for the answer. It's from Agência Zutu and Aberje Associate. A common explanation for the widespread adoption of ESG is that millennials are more prone to sustainable investing. How much of this is actually true? Or perhaps we should look on the other direction, from the changes in corporation and particularly in finance guiding the younger generation's investment behaviors.
Sure, thank you, Leonardo. And it is true. It is part of the story, so it's true. And if you look, even for large investment banks and strategists on Wall Street or in other financial centers, when they do surveys, in general, institutional investors and perhaps pensioners care more about the value of their portfolio, and they want it to do no harm, but they want to make sure that they're maximizing their returns. What's really refreshing about millennials, and perhaps it's because they have a longer term by which to make their financial investments matter, is that over that long term, they really want to have a baseline to say, I want this to have not a bad effect and hopefully a good effect on people and planet. I guess, so it's definitely part of the story, but I would say if someone asked me, what is driving the incorporation of ESG into what I understand now is nearly 40 trillion of assets under management around the world. Those are largely institutional investors who have major clients and are catering to long-term value and, of course, alignment with environment and society. So definitely part of the story. I would throw a question. If there are any millennials in the audience, my question would be, how much money would you be willing to lose? Yeah, okay, very good. So to both of you, how much money would you be? It's one thing to say, I want my impact to sit alongside financial returns. But if for a few years in a row, you get negative financial returns and your colleagues around the table are getting 10, 12, 15%, hypothetically, how much tolerance do you have to benefit from the social impact if you were giving up financial returns? You may not have to give up financial returns, but I think it's important to understand those experiences, that there's a range. Philanthropy is on one side, pure financial investing is on the other side. And there's a spectrum where investors will be comfortable, and it's different for everyone.
Thanks, Robert. And we go to another question now to Keivan. There is a thin line. It's a question by Alessandra Vasconcelos from the Faculdade Casper Libero. There is a thin line between the practices of sustainability in the search for social justice, biodiversity, equilibrium, and business ethics, and sustainability as a competitive strategy of corporations in the search for recognition and reputation. What do you think is the role for corporate communication sustainability in this process? How to achieve a reasonable balance between business and genuine social and environmental responsibility?
So thanks, Vinicius, for the questions. If you allowed me just to try to comment a little bit by the previous question that was addressed to Robert, I think that not only the millennials generation, but even the previous generation, I think they are caring more about what the pension funds are doing with the investments of the money that they should receive by the short future or the medium and long-term future. You know that there are some movements in the UK like make my money matter. So people, I think that the conscience of people that why what is happening with my money, I think they are caring more. And I think is the way that probably when we have pension funds on board, I think that all these agenda regarding not only ESG, but also in general aspects of sustainability is going to change, because they are the ones that can shift a little bit the needle, so we can see very good results in the short future. Just trying to address the question that you raised to me. I think that we are very lucky at Natura & Co group, because we gather 4 amazing brands, and all of them are a purpose-driven business, which means that since the foundations of each one of the companies, we have unique founders that try to bring on board this kind of mindset. So I think that what we are doing, and just taking the example of Natura, that it's a Brazilian found company, that we see by the timeline of Natura, that since the foundation of the company, we are showing and we are trying to implement a different corporate behavior. So imagine that Natura was founded by the end of the 60s, where normally the beauty sector is trying to push synthetic ingredients. And one of the reasons that we named the company as Natura is because we try to implement natural ingredients. Since the early 80s, we try to offer what we call the refill packaging. So it's a much more simple packaging that can reduce the environmental impact and also can offer to the customers a reduction cost for the same product with the same quality. So I think that by the end, of course, the reputation and the credibility and recognition of the company is created by his timeline. It's not something that you're going to build that just making the communications of the annual report. But I think that by the end, of course, it's a very thin line between what are the things that we are building because we understand that should be part of our business model and our corporate behavior, and what are the things that we just want to build the image of the company. So I think when you are communicating these kind of stuff, I think that is going to be very clear to the people that are access these kind of materials, how in bad is this process. And especially we consider that this model of the integrate reporting is something that we can give some visibilities about the importance that we are giving, not only for the financial result, but also about the performance that we have on the environmental and social field. Just to give another example is that Natura launched by 2014 a vision for 2050. Although it was a very long vision term, we established some goals for 2020. And of course, we deliver most of them last year. And last year, actually, at the group level, we launched our vision 2030. And the idea of this sustainability vision should be faced as what is going to be the minimum requirements that each one of the business from our group is going to deliver. And the idea is how we can try to push the bar and raise the bar, not only in our sector, but for the private sector in general. So I think that, and one of the aspects that we realized from COVID-19 is that probably this kind of competitive strategy, I think is we are replacing, because by the end, the consumer, what they are demanding, of course, is products that are going to deliver quality and performance, but also how we are addressing some causes and purpose that the consumers share and the civil society share in the same value. So I think that that is the challenge that we faces, and I think that is how we are addressing this kind of balance between our corporate behavior as well as the demand that and the trends that we are seeing inside this society in general.
Thank you, Keva. Perhaps if Gabriela also wants to comment on the millennial issue, but I will ask the question first. It's a question, we'll start with Gabriela, but also I would like to extend the question to Robert. It's from Rafael Santos from BRF, an Aberje associate. What are the biggest challenges for the consolidation of ESG reporting worldwide and in Brazil?
Thank you, Leonardo. Just a brief comment about pensions, and I guess, also as millennials, just to point out, the prospects of pensions, if you are an academic in the UK, are not so promising. But I'm not going to go into that discussion. But definitely, I guess we have evidence and research that shows that millennials care about this, and this vision of where they want to see also the generations coming, their kids, their grandkids. Being able to see nature and to, that they will be putting an emphasis on this. So now going back to the question that I was asked. So in terms of, I will start unpacking the question. I'm an academic, so I always care about, definitions of what we mean by consolidation. I think if we take consolidation here as a synonym for institutionalized, and we can see that definitely it's a norm now. In the video that I recorded, some of the figures. We know the largest multinationals, companies, global companies around the world, the reporting has become the norm. And like Robert said, we've been talking also this for a long time now. The first reports started in the 70s, in the 80s. So this is nothing new. Of course, if we talk about, SMEs, the small and medium enterprises, the picture is quite different because, of course, they still don't have the capacity to engage in these processes. So that's, I guess, part of the, the institutionalization, that I think we have reached that point that it has become the norm. It's a process embedded in companies. Now, consolidation more in the, I take it as, is it fulfilling the purpose? Is it fulfilling this accountability mechanism? Companies being able now to communicate, address, engage with those stakeholders, but also I guess the more important, aim that is a way to make sure that companies are performing and that are evolving. I guess that's where I start having some questions and where the challenges are again emerging. So I think the first one is, of course, the absence of accountability, that we see that what gets published, rarely anyone is going to make sure that it is really impact and is really true actions. And at least, in the academic community, there's always this questioning of transparency, that it has always a positive connotation, and but we tend to, there's this term of transparency fallacy. So I guess stakeholders, consumers, they insist on corporate transparency as an expression of responsibility, but I think there's still that gap, right? We tend to assume that transparency means good behavior. And I guess the challenges also for me would be, the limits to self-regulation. We know that many of these ESG reporting is driven by voluntary commitments, and governments, because they don't have the means, they just don't want to deal with it. They're not checking, and they are not demanding. So most of the laws, at least at the national level, it's requirement to publish reports, not about the content and about the substance of those commitments. So I think that's the other challenge where I see. And I think a final one would be, and I explain a little bit more in the video, but where are we placing the limits on natural resources? We are really reaching a tipping point in terms of planetary limits, where the question needs to be now, beyond the firm level, beyond the performance level. How is this going to fit into the big picture of the climate limits and the thresholds that we know we are already, surpassing the capacity of this planet? So I think these are those challenges. And just, very briefly to talk about Brazil, I think that the focus, we know that Brazil as a market, we know it's very intensive in natural resources, agriculture, some of the industries that have a large carbon footprint. And of course, if we go into the governance topic, a history of scandals and corruption, where I can see that, the environment and the governance aspect are really going to become prominent. Investors want to see that companies are putting the right practices or correcting, some practices that in the past, were some raising concerns. So I think I will leave it there, as some of the challenges, globally, but for Brazil too.
Leonardo, can I follow on from that? Okay, excellent. So I wholeheartedly agree with what Gabriela said, and what I will do to focus. The OECD is doing work for the G20 this year through the Sustainable Finance Working Group. And all of these issues that Gabriela has mentioned are really critical issues and need to be addressed. And I think it applies equally internationally and Brazil. Different countries are at different stages of their development. I would argue that there is a bit of a first mover disadvantage here because there are a lot of mistakes that are happening. And I think Brazil, though making progress, is in a good place to learn from some of the shortcomings that we're seeing in major markets. So very briefly, let me give you a 7-point plan. First, clarifying what stakeholders need in terms of metrics is the first step. Second, addressing significant data gaps, and that's already happening in international organizations, particularly related to climate because there's such a focus on climate this year. Third, the need for common taxonomies. And I think Gabriela mentioned, you need to get the definitions right so people across the world know that they're talking about the same thing. And that's often overlooked, but it's critical. Fourth, consistency and comparability of metrics, which we discuss, I think we all agree, and there's a lot of focus at the OECD on getting that right. Fifth, prioritization of metrics and materiality. There's not enough discussion. The reason why there's a bottleneck right now is because there are different views about materiality. There's a general view about financial materiality, but what environmental materiality or even social materiality means is quite a big debate at this point in time, and more analytical work, including through academic organizations, is really needed to help address that. Sixth is the use of IFRS, for international accounting standards. They are going to be asked to take on TCFD reporting and climate reporting to make that a global standard. It's critically important, but it's only the first step. There's a lot more that needs to be done. And seventh, government action. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. It's great that there are private sector initiatives. It's critically important. Governments can't guess what the private sector needs, but once the private sector shows what metrics they're using and what the needs are, it's good for governments, supervisors, and regulators to create some sort of common standard with definitions, with metrics, with appropriate practices, and with verification so that it works to support market efficiency and market transparency. And it's good for society.
Thanks, both Gabriela and Robert. I don't know if Keivan would like to also address some words on this topic, or we should move to another question. What you prefer, Keivan?
Yeah, I think that I can address a little bit because it was very good points that both Gabriela and Robert touched a little bit. You know that we are seeing that since the end of the 90s, we have some this process of trying to standardize the metrics. The first, I think that this kind of template, it was a GRI. So Natura has adopted GRI since 2001. And I think that one of the ideas how we can try to disclosure the information about the performance of the company, not only in the financial dimension, but also social and environmental performance in a way that probably the investors and even the consumers can understand a little bit more how we can try to interpret it. Because by the end, I think that, yes, it's true. Transparency should be key, but we need to understand transparency as accountability. So not only the CEOs, but all the top executives of the company should have accountability, not only for the economic performance, but also by the environmental and the social legacy they are going to have. So that is the point that when we are analyze our business model, one of the concerns that we have, what is the legacy that we are going to deliver to society, which means that we are going to take in account what are the impacts that we have. It's true that there are so many dimensions that we are reaching the planet boundaries. So that is the reason that we need to realize and need to track what are the performance that we have. And that is the importance when we see movements like TCFD or even science-based targeted initiatives, where you can use a metric that using science data just to be sure about, and you can evaluate what is your real performance. And I think this movement that is starting with climate change, the idea is how we can try to expand this for nature. So there are some conversations about how we can try to set science-based target for biodiversity, how we can have the TNFD. But you know that by the reality, even by those topics on the environmental dimensions, it's not simple to identify what are the metrics to be used. So I think it's a working in progress that we need to do. But in the other hand, we are also aligning how the investors can interpret the informations that the private sector is disclosing.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I would follow up this question with you also now with two other questions that came in a sort of more practical matter on communication as well. The first one, it's Mariana Victorino, the Unico ID Tech, and also associate of Aberje. She asks, Keivan, what are the main changes on corporate communication to incorporate ESG? And Bruno Galba from Meta SA asks what corporate communication and communicators should do to act as a partner in the implementation of ESG actions.
Yeah, very good questions. I think that for addressing the first one, I think that one of the changes that we are seeing is that companies trying to implement these kind of templates just to standardize their performance. So I think that if you look even in the Brazilian companies, the implementation of standards like GRI, it's much more common to see companies reporting in this kind of framework. In the other hand, if you try to use the examples from the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, we are seeing also companies trying to connect their own performance with the famous 17 SDGs. And some of them are trying to connect even using the same KPIs and indicators that the United Nations is adopting. So I think that that is one of the parts that is changing. So not only to connect with your own strategy, but how we can try to connect with these global agenda. So therefore, we are seeing this movement, especially regarding the SDGs. I think that in the other hand, what we are seeing is that how companies can try to reshape the model that they are communicating, which means that just trying to take the example of Natura. So since 2019, our brand decided that let's try to communicate that we are a business that generate positive impact, which means that how we are going to show and disclose this to the market. So then we selected 3 causes. And with those causes, we try to have a very close approach to our consumers that are just pursuing beyond a product with quality and performance. Right? So I think that is one of the points. I think the other point is that companies has a challenge nowadays how to translate their governance model. So how they have the internal process, and one of them should be the risk management, just try to address those planet boundaries challenges, giving credibility about not only the business model by the numbers that we are showing, but also the consistency. Robert touched a little bit about consistency, and I think that one of the good things adopting, let's say, the GRI model and framework is that at least you are disclosing the performance of the last 3 years. So at least even a common people can understand what is the historical data about the things that you are doing. Regarding your second questions, I think that companies can try to act as a partner because they can try to engage their peers and try to mobilize other sectors to try to raise the bar. So let's try to standardize. I think that by the end, ESG is something that we are seeing, especially by Latin America, and we have been hearing a lot. And it's something that it's great that we are hearing this nowadays. it's a shame that we cannot hear this before, because by the end, companies are understanding that without delivering also and taking care about their responsibilities about their performance on the environmental and social dimensions, they are not going to sustain their financial results.
Thank you, Eva. The next question is for Robert. It's from our media partner, Revista Problemas Brasileiros. What the Brazilian finance can learn from what is happening with green finance in OECD countries?
Sure, thank you, Leonardo. So as I touched on before, I think there's a benefit from learning both the good practices and also shortcomings that are occurring as ESG really takes hold. So there's a lot of activity to integrate ESG, and it is leading to a certain amount of market fragmentation and greenwashing. But that's sort of a, I wouldn't say natural, but it's a progression where there are a lot of practices and it's turbulent, and we have to figure out what are better practices that really help serve society and create shareholder value and market integrity and benefit for people and planet. So I think there are a few. First, I think communications is important, and it needs to be well structured and consistent. So the TCFD reporting, establishing that, really taking the time to communicate and to provide metrics associated with TCFD reporting on climate, on risks and opportunities. For many companies, there are enormous opportunities, and I think it's equally important for markets and for society to understand the vision and where it's heading. It's important, and it actually motivates all stakeholders involved to get on board with it. It's not just about managing downside risk. And the second issue, I think, is there's a strong movement now toward climate transition reporting, where there are climate transition reports by companies that explain, they take a portion of TCFD that really focus on how they're traveling toward net zero. And there's a movement now prompted by asset managers and other institutional investors to focus on science-based targets. And there are different reports about what that actually means, but I think it's important. My point would be, they need to be verifiable. So if you have a plan how to get to 2050 or even 2030, just having an interim target for 2025 isn't enough. Management needs to be held accountable, at the very least on an annual basis, so that investors and other stakeholders and regulators understand how they're implementing their plan so that they can be judged. And I'm really encouraged to see that investors are saying, well, we may invest in companies that are still considered brown because they need capital and we want them to transition, so we want to invest and engage. And my question to them is, great, when you engage, if they're not implementing their plan, what will you do to you know, do you take back capital? Do you vote against the certain board members, et cetera? Make really clear, investors, what you will do to make them adhere to these net zero plans. And then the other thing I think Brazil can do and is doing is they're engaging on an international level. I'm really encouraged to see the Brazilian central bank has joined the network for the greening of the financial system, because for central banks, for financial stability purposes, for the reserve portfolio, and for supervision, are understanding the issues, the metrics, good practices across countries. And I think you know, Brazilian policymakers and regulators are really embracing this. And I think there is a lot of opportunity for Brazil to actually take the lead on good practices. So I would encourage that.
Excellent, Robert. Thank you. And next question is to Gabriela. It's a question made by Agência Tutu, an associate of Aberje, on greenwashing. The question is, on the topic of ESG criteria, is it possible to find a gap between the real impact and what is reported? How to improve on the field, particularly how society can demand more effective and efficient practices from corporation?
Thank you. Very interesting question. And I guess in academia, you know, greenwashing has really lots of attention from academics. And I guess we simply don't know, and I guess that's part of the problem, right? We are not able to verify the accuracy of that information. And although we know we have principles of reporting, if we look just at GRI, you know, that we have the principle of comparability, companies need to, timely disclose that information. They need to be clear, and they need to be, provide a balance, so not only the positives, but also highlight the negatives. And but in practice, we know it's very difficult to recognize that from the report. If you would go so much in detail, I actually did an exercise with my students checking, going back in time, the VW scandal, just to see if they could pick up some nuances of how in the reports they could track some indices that something was going on, but we couldn't. So I guess, that shows you that it's very difficult to identify that from the report. But going now into the second part of the question of how to improve this field, and that we know, greenwashing happens, but how can we ensure that society demands and can get, corporations to behave in a more responsible manner? I think it's about having proper systems of governance, and I think in governance from a very, as a system, where we need to pool the capacities of different actors. So we need, of course, we've talked already about government, more stringent role, that is, not just demanding reporting information, but that is also having those mechanisms in place, sanctions, consequences for those companies that are behaving badly. We know, of course, investors have the strong push to it, and we, going back to pension funds, that's the other way in which we can channel those demands to corporations. And I would still highlight the vital role of civil society at the more grassroots levels. I mean, this week we just had the climate litigation, this case that we just set precedent, and that would just, for all other environmentalist activist groups, that these can really have a positive consequences. So we know this was a concerted effort, if people are not familiar, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, 17,000 Dutch citizens, they were the ones that put forward this claim to the Dutch court. So I think, we shouldn't dismiss also the role that civil society is having through these grassroots movements, but I would still place some caution here on the, the more contextual factors where we see, just to mention Extinction Rebellion, that we know in the UK, the government was trying to place this movement as part of the terrorist list. And where we also know that in Latin America, just to give some numbers, 2019, there's a record, 212 environmental activists were killed. So, and we know it's Central America, Asia, these places where these things are happening. So I guess we can see in some context, Europe, where those things are working, but of course it's very different conditions in other places. And I guess just the other final, going back to this system of governance, enabling organized labor, and going back again to the recent cases where we saw Amazon, Uber also here in the UK, where they are setting precedent in letting those workers unionize, and where there's also another way in which stakeholders, the representation of those employees will be able to ask for responsible practices, at least here in the workfare of employees.
Thank you, Gabriela. I will keep on this topic. Next question is for Keivan. It's actually two questions regarding COVID-19. One from Simone Luciano from Pulso Beta. COVID-19 and social distancing measures enhanced social and economic differences, particularly in poorer countries. At the same time, we watched a more active role from companies fighting the social crisis. Do you see the S pillar becoming more important from now on?
Yeah, I think that it's a very important topic. That since we have starting the pandemic globally, in Brazil, of course, everyone knows the bad reality and sad reality that we are still facing and in the region, not only in Brazil, but also in the other Latin American countries. And I think that, yes, it's true. I think that the two main topics that we need to address by this 21st century is going to be climate crisis and inequality. And I think with the pandemic, we realize the importance about inequality. So that is the reason that we are giving much more attention on the S pillar of the ESG. Two comments about, one of them is that since we face the pandemic, we try to protect the life of our own employees, also our wide network with the consultants. We created a fund with 10 million reais just to support our consultants, but also how we can give support with the local communities that we operate, especially in the Amazon regions, and the collectors that we operate in the São Paulo states regarding the collections of the waste and plastic material, especially plastic materials. So I think that is one of the hands that we tried and offer, trying to support them with basic products like soap bars. But I think in the other hand, I think that we realize that how we can try to tackle an agenda beyond gender balance. I think that companies should establish their commitment beyond gender balance and even try to communicate about equitable pay. So that is one of the commitments that we establish in our Vision 2030, which, by the way, we call this vision a commitment to life. So I think that this importance about life is something that we reinforce, especially last year. I think the other topic, when we are talking about the S, we have it seen, especially by the regions, an increase about domestic violence, which is a sad situation. And of course, how we can try to tackle opportunities to address inequality and also to include diversity and inclusion beyond the legislation that we face in Brazil regarding disabled and mentally and physical disabled percentage that we need to achieve. I think that when we are addressing the business model of Natura and Avon, we are talking about social selling, which since the foundation of Avon is starting the opportunity, when we are talking about the S, to give opportunity to women to have an income. So I think that is just a starting point that we have. And by the end, I think that companies are realized that although normally they trend to have this corporate behavior regarding their environmental impact, companies nowadays are realizing that we should give the same importance about the S, the social pillar, as the same way that we are addressing the environmental pillar for such a long time. So I think that that is the challenge that we are facing. And I think that the pandemic gave us the opportunities how to review the process in general and how we will tackle this. One of the commitments that we establish in this Vision 2030 is how we can have 30% of underrepresentative groups inside our management level and above. So I think that is the point that a company should try to have a review process by their commitment, considering how they can enhance and contribute with the social aspect of the ESG.
That's very interesting what you just mentioned here, because it's actually almost a preparation for our next question to Gabriela. The question came by João Paulo Rabelo from Anglo Gold Ashanti, also associate of Aberje. He's asking Gabriela, how diversity and inclusive initiatives impact on the corporate ESG score? In other words, how diversity practice impact on the S pillar? I think it's a quite good connection what Keivan just said here.
Yes, absolutely. I think he already gave us some interesting insights on this. But I would start, the question concentrates on the S pillar, but I think there's a clear relationship here on governance, right? And I think now the expectation is that boards should be diverse, should be inclusive. And I guess it's, beyond the ticking box exercise that your board is diverse and that you demonstrate, through some metrics that you are accomplishing that goal. It's more about how, by having, the more the impact of having that diverse board, that you will be able, your diversity reflects stakeholders' views. So by having these views as part of your input in your policies, in the development of new strategies, you will be able to listen to other voices through those diverse people in the board. Now, in the social aspect, we already talked about the pandemic and the impact of how the pandemic has hit women in the workforce, especially hard. And they saying we've probably gone back 50 years again, and many women had to take care now of the household and kids. And so I think we need to revisit now again, how are we going to make sure that we empower women in the workplace, but also other groups that are still underrepresented in the organization, and how the company is able to support them. And I think here there's a clear business case for that. I think, from the academic literature, there's a clear indication that supporting, promoting, making sure that those employees are able to grow in the company will have beneficial advantages for the company. And I think the final point would be more than the ESG criteria, the impact of those products and services. And as we know, many companies have foundations, they have set up philanthropy programs where they want to support some underrepresented communities.
Thank you, Gabriela. This is the final individual question. I'll ask Robert a point that he mentioned before, and then we go to a question to the three of you. Robert, it's from André Rocha from Agência Tutu. Despite the misalignment of the environmental agenda of many governments, including in Brazil, the private sector appears to be trying to incorporate and promote sustainable practice. What is the reach of this process without the cooperation of governments?
Sure, thank you, Leonardo. So I did touch on it, but let me make clear, I do think it's very important that the private sector, both corporate sector and the financial system, make as much progress as they can, and to allow many different approaches and methodologies and practices to flourish, because only then can you really understand what good practices should be. So in a sense, we talk about sandboxes with fintech. This is one major sandbox across the world to see how these practices and the trade-off between providing a lot of information and transparency with what other panelists has said, good information that's really decision useful information. And that's not something that regulators or governments can do in isolation, nor should they. They're not the specialists in it. So I think the progress that's been made, while it may look sloppy and there may be greenwashing, it's clearly progress. So I would definitely encourage Brazilian companies through their own efforts, inside out, and then through internal fora and what they see from peer institutions and international discussions and international organizations like OECD publications. We're doing a lot of work in this area to try and make sense of it, put their effort into it, do the best job that they can, learn in the process, understand and engage with constituents, that it is a learning process. And takes a lot of communication. So those of you on the call who are communication specialists, it's very important. And then, of course, I do think at some point there is a point for government, and that is transitioning from a lot of good efforts and many different approaches to say, for the sake of consistency, so that this is really useful information from which decisions from investors to regulators, how they can make decisions. And that needs standardization. And standardization, yes, it can come from private sector forums or from professional bodies. But what we're seeing is that since finance is global, and in many cases corporates are global, you need to have global consistency. And that's why the work right now at the G20 and NGFS and IFRS are all focusing on creating some level of global consistency so that it can create a better foundation, frankly, for sustainable growth. If you align finance with sustainable growth on a global basis, it will reduce risks and it will improve the ability for, if nothing else, an orderly transition to low carbon economies. And I can see already, I'm not a Brazilian specialist, but I can see from the press, both companies and governments are really starting to get engaged, and society is helping to prod them in that process. And it seems like it's making good progress in that area. But as we've said, there are a lot of examples of greenwashing. So I think it's an incumbent upon academia, civil society, and governments to make sure that we reduce the greenwashing and we reward companies that are genuinely making progress to make their information transparent, but then commit to activities in accordance with their plans.
Excellent, Robert. I think you also put some points here that will guide us for this last question that we have for all of you. And we would like to ask if you could address that with a short and precise answer for that thing, because I think it actually can act as a good message as well from the three of you. And we are two questions that are asking quite similar things. The first one by Natalia Martinez from Edelman, associate of Aberje. She asks is ESG a fad, or has it come to stay and build better relations between corporations, society, and the environment? And another one from Monica Cota from Alubar, also associate of Aberje. Given the intensity of the ESG media coverage, could it be seen as a fad? How to deal with this theme without appearing to be profiting for the moment? So I would like to ask each one of you if you could, short and precise, just address those points as a conclusion for our talk today. We could start with Robert, and then Keivan, and then Gabriela to finish it. Thank you.
So there's certainly a lot of enthusiasm for ESG because different parts of society and certainly investors are being asked. So institutional investors are being asked by their own clients, I want to make sure that I have a green portfolio or a high ESG portfolio. So they're certainly engaging. Yes, it's a fad in the sense that there is a sharp rise in enthusiasm, but the fact that there is so much effort now by international organizations and international accounting practices and such to establish standards. Once standards are established, by definition, this is no longer a fad. The fad is many practices are in existence, but the fact that it's being standardized means we're converting from fad to consistent practice. And I would imagine in many cases that would be enshrined in some form of regulation and supervision to make it here to stay.
If I may jump in and complement what Robert said, I think that by the end, I don't think that should be considered as a fad, but more as a fate. I think that all companies need to realize that is the fate that they need to deliver and implement. So I think that we need to change the culture mindset that we have. Normally, we have this mindset about the trade-offs. We need to understand that we have to have an embed by the decision-making process that we need to have this mindset of the integrate mentality. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible. We need to seek win-win-win solutions, which means that good for the planet, good for the society, and good for the company.
Now my turn. So I guess reiterating what Robert said, and from the beginning, he said he's been working also in sustainability and CSR for a while. As academics, we keeping track of those changes of labels and corporate citizenship, and then the sustainability triple bottom line. So yes, I think from an academic point of view, there's still we remain cautious in claiming victories on ESG. But something that I would like to highlight, and maybe covering the last part of the question in the more, how to deal with this without appearing, to profiting from the moment, and this notion of, that is a journey that is about maturity, and that companies cannot just jump in, one day and say, I want to really showcase that I'm, addressing lots of issues around my ESG, agenda. I think they need to make credible commitments. And I think civic society now is being more, paying more attention on those commitments that, you show that you have a substantial way to demonstrate that, and not just saying, I'm addressing this issue because it sounds good to, to have it in my report. So I think it's that issue of demonstrating that this is a journey. And I think Keivan said, the long term, that this is a big journey, but you need to make sure that you demonstrate those commitments throughout your journey, and you keep updating them throughout.
Thank you very much, the three of you. And I think you really gave us what we were searching for in this conversation here. It's exactly to build up this bridge that will help us to understand how impactful the ESG agenda is today, and not only thinking about today, but thinking about the future of our planet, and thinking also about the future of corporations, because without one, we can have the other, basically here. From the side of Brazil Institute, I just would like to thank you all again, as well as thank Aberje for this cooperation. Brazil Institute is this institution that is here to make bridges between Brazil and the UK. And again, I think with activities like that, we are accomplish our mission. So thank you, and I will pass the word now to Leonardo to conclude our session today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just the final comments. I'd like to recall everybody that the video of this live will be available here in Aberje YouTube channel, as well in our website, together with all the other videos from this first series of blended webinar. You can find the link on the description below of YouTube. I'd like to thank all our viewers and everybody who sent questions, including journalists from Valor Econômico this time. Special thanks for our media partners, Revista Problemas Brasileiros and Plataforma Brasil, everybody at King's College London and at Aberje who made this series possible, and to my co-host Vinicius. I hope to see you again soon.